The church bells of St. Matthew's rang across the main square as the usual afternoon hum was interrupted by the screech of tires. An old pickup truck, loaded with furniture and tools, came to a sudden halt in front of the central bench. Mr. Anderson, a well-known carpenter in the small town of Maplewood, jumped out hurriedly, holding a leash tied to a tan-colored mixed-breed dog. "Stay here, buddy," he said firmly, as if his words alone could calm the restless animal. Without further explanation, he climbed back into the truck and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Buddy tugged at the leash, barking frantically. He wriggled free but didn't chase after the truck. Instead, he returned to the bench where Mr. Anderson had left him. His eyes remained fixed on the road where the truck had disappeared, drawing the attention of a few vendors still lingering in the square. "Who leaves a dog like that?" murmured Mrs. Florence from her flower stall. Some children tried to approach Buddy, but the dog backed away, wary. Hours turned into days, and Buddy didn't move from his spot. On the first night, rain poured down, and the vendors found the dog shivering and drenched under the bench. One of them, a young man named Jake, offered him a piece of bread. "Don't worry, he'll come back," Jake said with a smile, but Buddy didn't seem to notice. He refused the food and continued his vigil, as though leaving his post might break an unspoken promise. News of the dog spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Some neighbors began bringing food and water, but Buddy barely took what he needed to survive. Efforts to adopt him were unsuccessful. Mrs. Florence, known for her love of animals, even tried to take him home. "You can't stay here forever," she insisted, securing him with a brand new leash. But Buddy slipped out of it with surprising ease and returned to his bench immediately. As winter approached, concern for Buddy grew. "That dog can't stay out there in the cold," declared Mr. Wilson, the owner of the general store. "If no one takes care of him, he'll die." Others, like Jake, saw something extraordinary in Buddy's patience. "He knows something we don't," Jake argued, convinced that Mr. Anderson would return. Yet no one could deny that the lonely figure of the dog in the freezing wind was a painful reminder of absence. Speculation about Mr. Anderson's whereabouts swirled around town. Maybe he had an accident, some suggested. Or perhaps he never intended to come back, others whispered. But while theories multiplied, Buddy remained unyielding, a living statue of hope. Passing by him, the people of Maplewood felt something they couldn't quite name. It wasn't just pity, it was a mix of admiration and guilt. One evening, Mrs. Florence found Jake laying a small blanket near the bench. "That dog's going to break everyone's heart," she said softly, watching as the young man gently patted Buddy. For the first time, Buddy didn't pull away. Jake smiled as though it were a victory. When spring arrived, Buddy had become a part of Maplewood's daily rhythm. At dawn, he was always sitting on the same bench, watching the dirt road leading into town. In the afternoons, he lay under a nearby tree, his eyes fixed on the same direction. Despite his constant presence, feelings about Buddy divided the town. "He's not just a dog, he's a lesson in loyalty," Jake often said, defending Buddy's unshakable faith. Children wove tales around him, imagining he could understand human speech and knew secrets about the town. But others, like Mr. Wilson, grew irritated. "That dog's attracting more flies than customers," he grumbled, sweeping the front of his store. He even proposed sending Buddy to a shelter in a neighboring city, only to be met with fierce opposition. "Those shelters euthanize dogs after 3 days," Mrs. Florence retorted angrily. The debate reached a boiling point during a sudden April storm. Lightning lit up the sky, and torrential rain battered the town. The neighbors hoped Buddy would seek shelter, but to their horror, they found him soaked, steadfastly waiting at the foot of the bench. Jake rushed to him with an umbrella and a blanket, but Buddy didn't budge. "It's a miracle he's still alive," Mrs. Florence said the next morning as she tried to dry him off. The storm left more than flooded streets. It left a crack in the community. Some began to question the dog's loyalty. "Maybe his owner doesn't deserve this devotion, Mr." Wilson argued, but Jake saw something else. "He's teaching us something," he said to a group of neighbors who listened, skeptical. His words planted a seed of unease. How far were they from keeping their own promises? Over time, the arguments faded, and Buddy became a symbol of Maplewood. Tourists passing through the town started photographing him and sharing his story online. "The dog who waits," they called him. Some even left tips for local vendors to buy Buddy food. But despite the attention, Buddy remained reserved. He accepted only what he needed and never took his eyes off the road. One day, a journalist named Emma arrived in town, intrigued by Buddy's story. She interviewed the townsfolk, piecing together fragments about Mr. Anderson. "He was a quiet, hard-working man," Mrs. Florence recalled. "Buddy was his only friend." But no one could explain why he had left or where he had gone. Following a lead, Emma discovered that Mr. Anderson had been in a car accident en route to another town. He had survived but suffered memory loss, spending years in a rehabilitation center unaware of who he was. Emma found him and brought him back to Maplewood. As the sun began to set, the truck carrying Mr. Anderson rolled into the square. Buddy was at his usual spot, watching the road. At first, he didn't react. Then, as Mr. Anderson stepped out of the truck, Buddy's ears perked up. The dog's body stiffened, his eyes locked on the man. "Buddy!" Mr. Anderson called, his voice trembling with emotion. The dog hesitated for a moment, as though verifying what he was seeing. Then, with sudden determination, Buddy rose and ran toward him. The reunion was as silent as it was powerful. Buddy sniffed at Mr. Anderson, his tail wagging hesitantly before he leaned into the man, pressing his head against his chest. Mr. Anderson knelt with difficulty, his eyes filling with tears as he stroked the dog's back. "I'm so sorry, Buddy," he said, his voice breaking. "I left you waiting too long." After the initial wave of joy, questions arose about what had happened to Mr. Anderson. That evening, as the town buzzed with chatter, he sat with Buddy by his side, explaining his story to a small group of neighbors. "I had an accident on the way to another town," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "I lost my memory. I didn't even know who I was or where I came from." He looked down at Buddy, who was resting his head on his knee. "I never meant to leave him." Local businesses thrived as tourists bought souvenirs and food, many leaving donations for Buddy's care. Emma, the journalist, stayed in Maplewood to document the unfolding events. She spent hours interviewing Mr. Anderson, Jake, Mrs. Florence, and others, piecing together the complete story of Buddy's unwavering loyalty. Her article, titled "The Dog Who Never Gave Up," was published online and quickly went viral. Comments poured in from around the world, praising Buddy's devotion and Mr. Anderson's eventual return. Despite the attention, Buddy remained the same reserved, loyal dog he had always been. He spent most of his time with Mr. Anderson, following him wherever he went. The two were inseparable, their bond seemingly stronger than ever. Mr. Anderson, now physically weaker and more reliant on the town's help, found solace in Buddy's presence. "He waited for me," he often said. "I owe him everything." Anderson and Buddy sat on the same bench where the dog had waited all those years. "This spot," Mr. Anderson mused, running his hand over Buddy's fur, "it's where everything changed for both of us." Emma, sitting nearby with her camera, captured the moment. Man and dog, side by side, framed by the golden light of the setting sun. It became the centerpiece of her feature, a photo that resonated with people far and wide. Months turned into years, and life in Maplewood settled back into a steady rhythm. Buddy, now older and slower, still walked with Mr. Anderson to the square every morning. The bench where he had waited was adorned with a small plaque donated by the townspeople. It read, "In honor of Buddy, the most loyal dog." Visitors continued to stop by, taking photos and leaving flowers at the bench. One cold winter morning, the townsfolk noticed something unusual. The bench was empty. Buddy and Mr. Anderson, who rarely left the square, were nowhere to be seen. Concerned, Jake and Mrs. Florence went to check on them. They found Mr. Anderson and Buddy at home, peacefully resting side by side. Both had passed away during the night. The news shook Maplewood. The loss of the man and his dog was felt deeply, not just in the town, but by everyone who had followed their story. The square, once a place of longing and hope, became a gathering spot for remembrance. Flowers, candles, and notes from around the world were left at the bench, creating a makeshift memorial. Emma returned to Maplewood to cover the outpouring of love for Buddy and Mr. Anderson. In a televised interview, she said, "Their story reminds us that loyalty and love can endure even the hardest trials. Buddy waited for years, and in the end, they found their way back to each other. It's a story we'll never forget." Anderson with a permanent monument. A life-sized bronze statue of Buddy sitting on the bench was placed in the square, with Mr. Anderson's name etched below. The square was renamed Buddy's Plaza, and every year on the anniversary of their passing, the townspeople gathered to celebrate their legacy. Emma's final article about Buddy and Mr. Anderson closed with these words: "In life, they were separated by time and circumstance, but their bond never wavered. Their story teaches us the value of patience, love, and the promises we make to one another. Buddy's wait wasn't just about loyalty, it was about hope, and hope, as they proved, is never in vain." Years later, children played in Buddy's Plaza, their laughter filling the air as tourists snapped photos of the statue. The story of the dog who waited and the man who returned lived on, passed down through generations. And though time marched on, Buddy's unwavering loyalty remained a symbol of what it means to keep a promise, no matter how long it takes.